Very special thanks to Affordable Prestige Cars in Glastonbury for providing, of course, the BMW in this review, and if you're a long-time fan of this series, you will of course recognise the name, typically for Jaguars, but also for other exotics and luxury cars, such as this one. So of course, if you're interested in something like this, or sourcing a vehicle like this with them, of course, click the link right below the video in the description to jump over to their website. It's often said that the mark of somebody who's good at something is that they make it look easy. Well, by that metric, I would say that BMW has done a pretty amazing job with this generation of 6 Series. Now, this is not the first time I've spoken about this generation of 6 Series on the channel. As some of you will recall, back in 2020, I spoke about a car which I, at the time, had no interest in reviewing. In fact, I wasn't even at the dealership to review the car in question, and I only did so because the car that I was there for wasn't available. That was a 640d, the two-door version of this same platform with that incredible diesel engine. And I mean incredible, it's one of the best I've ever driven with a diesel power plant. This, on the other hand, was a car which, from one sense, I was just really interested in driving because I love the Gran Coupe, I love the four-door layout, but also I was curious to see, could the car appeal to me and impress me as deeply as that one did, without the gimmick of an amazing diesel engine? Could it have a more expected BMW V8 and still feel as interesting? Well, at the risk of spoiling the outcome, the simple answer is yes, but in completely different ways. And actually, I'm going to say something pretty heavy about this car, and by extension the other one which I reviewed as well. I don't think I've ever said this about maybe any other car that I've reviewed, even though I do believe it about certain others as well. This is simply put what I like to call an everything car. It's a vehicle which, as far as I'm concerned, honestly is about as perfect as you can get. You can always nitpick something. You can always say, well, I don't like that particular angle. I don't like this particular menu layout. I prefer this sound or that performance. But ultimately, there are certain cars which tick every conceivable box, at least to a really impressive degree, if not completely. And I can honestly say, for me at least, the 6 Series of this generation is simply one of those cars. Be it with a diesel, or with a petrol, with 2 doors, or with 4. In the case of this car, it's an interesting place on the market that the 650i in particular, which is what I'm driving, the M Sport, of course, with the M Sport body kit as well, rather than the more subtle SE styling, which some have. This is a car which occupies, as I mentioned, a curious place. It reminds me of how sometimes other brands like Jaguar and various others too will have a car which is the out-and-out performance model. In the case of Beamer, of course, that's the M6. But then they also have another model which might even share that same engine. Mercedes has often done a similar thing, especially a few years back. You'd have something like the SL sports car. You'd have the obvious twin-turbo SL65 AMG with crazy performance and styling that's appropriate for it, but then you'd have something like an SL600. Not as obvious of a name, there's no AMG badge, but underneath there's a crazy monster V12 still. That is exactly what this is to the 6 Series range. It doesn't have the M6 badge, it doesn't have the carbon roof and the fancy body kit and the big quad pipes, but it's got a variation of the same engine, the 4.4 litre twin-turbo V8. It's just set to a tune that's a little bit more sedate, and a bit more focused on the luxury driving and the long distance comfort rather than just the brutal side. Don't let that fool you though. This car is seriously, properly quick. That engine still puts out 444 horsepower, which these days you could say, well, I'd expect maybe a bit more than that, but it also puts out 480 pound-feet of torque, which is 680 newton meters. That's starting to sound a little bit more impressive. Well, if that's impressive, check this out. It does 0 to 60 in 4.3 seconds, which only a couple of years ago would have been basically supercar territory, if not, at the very least, a super sports car, not a literal 1.8 ton 4-door super coupe, which is of course what the Gran Coupe is. Even the two-door version, of course, with that same engine, shares a similar incredible spec sheet, and it belies the understated looks. I've always been a fan of cars which are sleepers. They're better than they actually look. And that's not to say that they're ugly, they just look more calm and sedate and classy, but then underneath they're kind of savage. This car can be that. But the crucial word in there is can, and that is the real beauty of the performance on this generation. And to some degree you could even say that that's carried over to the diesel as well, which is kind of nuts, and that is that Beamer did such a fantastic job of making this car a vehicle that you can choose what you want it to be. You can choose to set it in comfort, comfort plus, eco mode, and just have it as a super stylish, effortlessly elegant, really comfortable, very spacious, long distance cruiser. Essentially like a really cool looking executive car. But then you change a couple of settings and now you can actually feel the full effect of a 444 horsepower 0 to 60 in Ferrari territory rear-wheel drive 4-door coupe, and the appropriate performance to a vehicle like that, which can actually rival something like even a previous generation M3 and even some current generation Beamers, which you'd be surprised that this could keep up with. Except, as I mentioned earlier on, it does all of that under the veneer of civility. It's not as obvious as an M6, it's got the sleeper factor. And I think that for a certain type of buyer, myself included even potentially, that has a very distinct appeal. Being faster than it looks is inherently cool when it comes to a luxury car especially. This is a biblically fast car, except at the same time, even the efficiency and the road tax are very reasonable. Now, road tax might not appeal or interest everyone, but here in the UK at least, it's £165 a year. For a twin-turbo 4.4 litre V8, that's pretty nuts. The fuel economy is quoted at 23 to the gallon city, 41 on the motorway, and an average of about 32. Of course, in practice, with those all over the place numbers, your mileage will proverbially vary. But the point is that across the board, that's really good. And the crazy thing to me about this car is that if you look at the size of the engine, the power, the torque, even the performance, well, in a more obvious choice of German counterpart, which goes over the top in terms of appearance, that means that this is literally on par with a Porsche Panamera GTS, which of course I also reviewed. That car is very shouty about what it can do, and that's of course why you would buy it. This is the more classy version of that concept, and I think that both work beautifully, except unlike a Panamera, the 6 Series is kind of universally a pretty design. Now, the interesting difference between this and the previous generation, and I actually went into a video comparing the two, especially when it comes to the diesels, is that the previous car felt more like this very 2000s, really tanky vehicle, especially with that diesel engine. Like, it could never be phased, but also it didn't necessarily reach its full potential. But with tuning, it could. This generation feels, to me at least, as controversial as this might be to older 6 Series owners, a car where every single inch of the car has a ton of effort, time, and engineering poured into it. This feels like a car that was not made by committee. This is not a 5 Series, it's not a 3 Series, it's not just another executive sedan, as great as they are at their own thing. This is a car that's made with love, or at least that's the way it feels. So even if it was made by a committee, they did a damn good job of it, because it hides that, even if that is the case. Ultimately, this is a car which for me expounds on the idea that I believe Mercedes actually started a few years prior with that first generation CLS, the swoopy idea of a 4-door coupe. Mercedes kind of started that trend, or you could argue that maybe Mazda did with the RX-8. But many other companies since then have jumped on board, and I think, to be honest, BMW is probably my favourite, using this platform to do that with. It's just a stunning looking car, and again, I can't stress enough how much I personally love being inside one of these. The interior is gorgeous, and much like the i8, another one of my favourite Beamers, It's a car that looks every bit as new now as it did when it came out. Now, interestingly, speaking about when these cars came out, this one is one of the really late models. The mileage is really low, it's a 2018 shape, but curiously, through that model run, from around 2011 up until technically 2019, but more so 2018, they had a lot of updates, and the engine, for example, changed a lot. So if you're on the market for one, an earlier car is going to have about 402 horsepower. One of these later ones, 444. The earlier cars have about 440 pound-feet of torque, which is 600 newton meters, and as I mentioned earlier, this car has 680. The 0 to 60 drops from 4.7 to the aforementioned 4.3, so there is a surprising amount of variation between just which year you choose. And generally speaking, to set that delineation line, up to 2013, you're going to have the lower numbers. After 2013, you're going to have the numbers that this car is working with. So if you want the best of the bunch, go for one like this, the later in the range, up around 2018 or so if possible. Now, in terms of the overall package, as I said earlier on in the video, this is a car which I would honestly struggle to find something bad about. I don't think there really is much, if anything, to complain about this car. What two things could possibly be complained about? Well, I guess one thing for me is that I often love to have all-wheel drive. Except here's the thing. They made some with all-wheel drive. It's called the X-Drive, and although they're hard to find in the UK, they do exist, so you could even import one if you wanted it. Although I think for many BMW drivers, you're probably more of a fan of rear-wheel drive to begin with anyway. The second thing is, and this one is kind of a curiosity to me, some people of course prefer the hardcore manual driving experience, which is less suited to something like this, I would say, but still, some people would like the idea. Well, they did that too. But curiously, for the US market only, which I think is kind of an odd choice. It's surprising that, to me at least, they would only do that in the States and then not in Europe. So that one's a 6-speed manual. Most of them that you'll see over here or in Europe or anywhere else will have an 8-speed. It's a ZF transmission, and then of course the M6 at the top of the tree doesn't need those 8 gears because it's less about efficiency, more about performance, so that one has 7. So in terms of efficiency, a car like this, or the 640D if diesel is the way for you, they really straddle the line between two distinct personalities so well, and having that crucial choice of what you want the car to be is easily its biggest strength. With many cars, take a sports car for example, that's it. You don't have a choice. It's just a sports car. You have to use it as such with very little variation. Then you have a luxury car, something like, an old school Bentley or a Rolls Royce from the 70s, 80s, 90s. It's just a luxury car. That's it. Unless you do heavy modifications, you're not going to be winning a track day lap record anytime soon. But a modern car, especially with the advances in technology and efficiency, this being a perfect example, it truly is both. And it's all done at the flick of a couple of buttons. I love that. And that is, to go back to my original point at the start of the video, exactly why I call vehicles like this an everything car. It's got the look, the sound, the performance, the handling, the comfort, even the efficiency, the space. Of course the driver space and front passenger are great. The rear passenger space is more than good enough, technically a 5-seater if you need to use that middle one. And as you'll have seen at some point in the video as well, the boot space is fantastic on the Coupe and the Gran Coupe. So it's not even like you have to sacrifice practicality. It does it all. It's a genuine GT, which in this case happens to have 4 doors. It really is a GT for the family. It's a GT car that you can live with every day, that you don't have to only use in summer or only use on weekends. And the fact that you can choose between the 4-door, the coupe and the convertible, much like a Porsche 911 with so much variation in there, it simply means you're going to tick more boxes in terms of who can get the best out of this platform. So for me, beyond rambling any further, I think you can kind of get the idea of why I love this generation of cars so much, and why I consider it to be such a fantastic choice of daily driver that is everything you could realistically want in a car. Ultimately though, I would love to hear the thoughts of people who've owned one, especially if you have any maybe guidance, suggestions, warnings perhaps for other potential owners or people who look to buy one of these down in the comments. Well, of course, drop that down below and let's get some discussion started there. Ultimately, if you haven't already, I would recommend checking out the 640D review as well as a bit of a comparison, and of course if you want to check out more reviews like this in future, then obviously stick around on the channel. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.